Welcome to the first in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 2. Today we are going to be talking about the world in 1648. As always, there are some key terms that you should be able to identify by the time this lecture is finished, and also some questions you should be able to answer by the last slide as well. So let's get to it. I'd like to begin this lecture by going through a couple of key ideas that we need to understand if we're going to understand what the life of an average person was like in 1648. One of those terms is inequality. And this is really a concept that is a big part of our lives today in the United States. But really we need to understand that the concept of equality was foreign to people in Western civilization in 1648. Maybe a better way to put it might be that people in 1648 simply accepted inequality as a fact of life. They would have found Jefferson's comment in our Declaration of Independence that, quote, all men are created equal, end quote, to be strange and wrong. To them, civilization was divided into the privileged and the poor. Or, to put it in the words of feudalism, people were either nobles or they were peasants. There were different laws for noblemen and peasants. Peasants often had to pay higher taxes than noblemen. Moreover, a peasant had to show a nobleman proper respect. In fact, a peasant might be beaten, jailed, or even executed simply for failing to show proper respect for his societal betters. These beliefs about inequality made it easy for this society to institute African slavery. We think of African slavery as an incredible evil, which it is. However, it wasn't that strange in the 17th century for people to believe that there was a class of humanity destined to serve others. In fact, slaves in America weren't treated that much differently than peasants in Europe. This was also a very superstitious time. As your text points out on pages 434 to 436, there was a belief that witches were real and actively working to undermine Christian society. Between 1560 and 1670, nearly 200,000 people were accused of being witches, or practicing witchcraft. Most were subjected to prosecution and mob violence. About a quarter of that 200,000 were executed by hanging, or, even worse, by being burned at the stake. Actually, life was tough for anyone who deviated from the religious norm. By laws, Jews were required to wear clothing that identified their religious heritage. They were also often concentrated into ghettos. This treatment of the Jews, this segregation of the Jews, this hatred of the Jews, is a concept we're going to run into again and again this semester. And the name for it is anti-Semitism. So keep that in mind. Protestants and Catholics were equally hard on the Jews. As Martin Luther wrote, whatever shall Christians do with the damned, rejected Jews? We can hardly tolerate having them live among us as they do. Here is what I recommend. First, we ought to burn down their synagogues and schools. Their homes, too, should be set ablaze and destroyed. Let all their prayer books and copies of the Talmud be taken from them. For it is by means of these that they propagate their idolatry, their lies, their foul cursing, and their blasphemies. Again, this quote comes from Martin Luther, the leader of the Protestant Reformation. So you can see that anti-Semitism was a fact of life for both Protestants and Catholics. Still, it's important for us to understand that the world of the 17th century was not stagnant. There were forces at work undermining the status quo. One of the most significant was the Reformation, which I just referred to on the last slide. To understand the Reformation, we must first understand the world before the Reformation. The Roman Catholic Church had dominated Western European Christianity for more than 1,000 years. By the 16th century, however, cracks in that domination were beginning to show. The first of the reformers to successfully break with the Roman Catholic Church was Martin Luther, and he launched the Reformation in the year 1517. Luther and other reformers attacked both the wealth and the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church, but they also attacked some of the basic principles of Catholic belief. Among the central beliefs of Protestants were the notion that salvation, or life after death, was only achieved through faith in Jesus Christ. That through faith in Jesus Christ, salvation came as a free gift from God. So Catholics at this point in time believed that salvation came through a combination of faith in Jesus Christ, but then also through the performance of good works, being a good Christian. So you could earn your way into heaven. That was kind of the idea that the church had at this time. Excuse me. Protestants at this time also argued that common people should have access to Scripture. The Roman Catholic Church at this point in time believed that Scripture should be written in Latin and in Greek, and therefore only the most highly educated individuals should be able to read the Bible, should be able to read the holy texts. Luther and other reformers argued that people needed to be able to explore the concept of faith for themselves. That this was the only way they could, in fact, understand salvation and God's grace. Finally, Luther and other reformers attacked the notion of priest celibacy. In other words, they believed that priests and nuns should be allowed to marry. And so this was, again, an idea that was central to the Protestant Reformation that was rejected by the Roman Catholic Church. The Reformation left Europe divided into Catholic and Protestant segments. But it didn't stop there. Luther's push to allow the people to interpret Scripture for themselves led to further divisions as Protestants split into smaller factions. Before the end of the 16th century, there were Lutherans, Calvinists, and Anglicans. While each of these groups was Christian, they had very, very different ideas about what it meant to be a Christian. These splits often led to war, as Catholics initially sought to destroy the new Protestant churches before they could take root. They failed. After 2 decades of fighting, the Peace of Augsburg was signed in 1555, whereby Catholic kings agreed to formally recognize the legitimacy of the Protestant Church. But this was not an end to the violence, however. The Peace of Augsburg did not stop religious civil wars from breaking out across Europe. One such civil war broke out in France, between the dominant Catholic Church and the Protestants, known in France as the Huguenots. One of the most atrocious events of the war between Protestants, or I should say Huguenots, and the Catholic Church in France occurred in 1572 with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. During this event, 20,000 French Protestants, or Huguenots, were killed by Catholic forces. But France wasn't the only place where religious differences led to war. The rise of the Anglican Church in England led the Catholic King of Spain to invade with one of the mightiest forces ever assembled in Western civilization. That fleet, known as the Spanish Armada, was defeated by England's Protestant forces in 1588. But these skirmishes were merely a prelude to the really big war. The 30 Years' War was fought between various Protestant and Catholic kingdoms from 1618 to 1648. Most of the fighting was done in Central Europe, specifically Germany. No one knows how many people died in the 30 Years' War. It was a very chaotic time, but estimates are that between 3 million and 11 million people died in this conflict. This war was often brutal and inhumane. Take this example from the fictional novel Simplicissimus, which was written by a veteran of the war, a man named Jakob von Grimmelshausen. As von Grimmelshausen writes, quote, "In the barn, the hired girl was handled so roughly that she was unable to walk away, I am ashamed to report. They stretched the hired man out flat on the ground, stuck a wooden wedge in his mouth to keep it open, and emptied a milk bucket full of stinking manure drippings down his throat." End quote. Here's another quote from that same source. "Then they used thumbscrews, which they cleverly made out of their pistols, to torture the peasants, as if they wanted to burn witches. Though he had confessed to nothing as yet, they put one of the captured hayseeds in the bake oven, and lighted a fire in it. They put a rope around someone else's head, and tightened it like a tourniquet, until blood came out of his mouth, nose, and ears. In short, every soldier had his favorite method of making life miserable for peasants, and every peasant had his own misery." End quote. The war finally came to an end with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Now, this war was so destructive that the Treaty of Westphalia tried very, very hard to prevent future conflicts between Protestants and Catholics. And it did this in a number of ways. First, it was determined that a balance of power was the key to keeping the peace. In other words, if all of the great powers were roughly equal in strength, one nation might think twice before going to war against another nation. To keep the powers roughly equal, the treaty transferred strips of land and entire populations from one nation to another. These changes were made regardless of ethnic groups. In other words, Germans often found themselves in non-German territories. French people found themselves in non-French territories. Italian people found themselves in non-Italian territories. This was all done in the interest of the balance of power. Now, while this idea worked in 1648 to maintain the peace, it is going to prove to be a disaster about 200 years later. So keep this idea in mind. The treaty also tried to keep Protestants and Catholic rivalries from tearing Europe apart by endorsing this idea known as Cuius Regio, Ius Religio. In short, this idea translated as, quote, one king, one faith, end quote. It meant that the king of a certain territory had the right to determine the faith of the members of his kingdom. If he was a Catholic, then his people had to be Catholic. If he was a Protestant, then his people had to be Protestant. This created a connection between the government and a specific church. France and Austria, for example, became Catholic nations. England was a Protestant nation, so was Sweden. The 30 Years' War also left kings in a much more powerful position than before. Under feudalism, for example, kings had rarely been able to get their own way. They had to rule in conjunction with the nobility. But the 30 Years' War changed all that. Kings built up massive armies to fight this war, and those armies were loyal to their king, not to a nobleman. Now, once the war was over, these armies could be turned towards keeping the peace at home. In short, this meant that kings could use their armies to enforce their will on both the nobility and the peasants. Kings became very, very powerful following the 30 Years' War. So, what did we learn in this lecture? The world in 1648 was first of all a world of great religious intolerance. We've discussed this with the warfare that existed between Catholics and Protestants. We also touched on it briefly when talking about witchcraft, as well as the treatment of the Jews. Another theme that we need to keep in mind from this lecture is that kings are growing more powerful. This is going to be a theme we're going to revisit in a couple of classes, so keep that in mind. And finally, here is your assignment for our next class. Please read the pages that are on this page, that are on this slide, I should say, and then answer the questions that follow in the style that I recommend below. So anyway, get to this. I hope that that this lecture was of value to you, that you have some idea of what it was like to live in 1648, and we're going to continue to discuss this in future classes. Thanks.